What's happening, guys? Welcome back to another video. It feels like it's been forever since I've done an upload. I think it's only been maybe nearly 2 weeks, but it's been too long. I have a whole lot of stuff to talk about this week. So a quick recap of the last couple of weeks. I went to my first ever photography workshop as an attendee. I've run my own workshops, so you guys know. But I decided things were getting a little bit stale and I wanted to improve and grow a little bit. So I went along to this workshop and it was just epic. I'm going to talk about that in another video so we can keep it all separate. I went over to Sydney with Sony for the Alpha Awards, and that was a really cool experience. Had a lot of fun, and I bought a new camera, which is what I'm talking about today. So I decided to go ahead. You've seen the title. I bought the A7R3 over the A7R4. The reasons for that we're going to get into now. Before I start off with this video, and all you guys that have bought an A7R4 are freaking out, don't worry. The A7R4 is definitely a better camera. There's really no upsides of the R3 other than the smaller megapixels for me. It's kind of a backwards bonus, but I prefer the smaller pixel size and the price. Other than that, the A7R4 is pretty much better with everything. For me, it's more about how much better it is. So if you're going to justify spending all that money, it's got to be a pretty big improvement for me. It's not a small gap in price. It's quite a big difference. So it's not like going from the A7R2 to the R3. That's a big jump in technology and performance, and the camera is much better than the A7R2. Going from the R3 to the R4, it's not as big of a jump. So for me, I wrote down a list of all the benefits about getting the R4 to try and justify it to myself, and I didn't manage to do it. Obviously, I bought an R3, but here's the list I made. So the first one was the grip. The grip is definitely better, definitely for my large caveman hands. It's a lot more comfortable. But with the battery grip on the R3s, it's fine, and I don't really have any issues with it. And that's not going to be for everybody. So I got a bunch of people at the wedding to hold the camera. I got my partner to hold the camera, and she knows nothing about photography, and she thought the A7R3 was nicer to hold. So it's, obviously she has little hands, and it's going to be different for everybody. So that's going to be for yourself to decide. But the overall body and the buttons and the dials are all much nicer on the R4. So you're going to see a pattern here. Everything about the R4 just makes the job more pleasant and more fun and more enjoyable, but doesn't really do anything that I can't do with my R3. The next thing other than the grip, like I said, was the dials and the buttons are all much more fluid and tactile, and they just feel nicer to turn and change and play with. I do really like, I hope it comes to the R3, but on the R4 you can program the front or the rear dial to ISO, which is really awesome. You can't do that with the R3 at this stage. So what that means is I can have the aperture on the lens with the G Master lenses, and I can have the shutter speed on one and the ISO on the other. That's really great because I don't like having it on the rear dial. I don't like having it on this one here because it's really easy to turn by mistake. So that's the downside for me. It's really awesome that the R4 has that update, and I really hope it comes to the R3. Same with that red focus point. That was a big one for me. If you guys have R3s, you know that, or any other Sony camera other than the new one, obviously, that red focus dot is a big plus. You'll notice that the black one gets lost in the frame, depending on what's in the background. But again, it's just a kind of nice thing to have. It's not something you really need. The other thing I noticed, because the A7R4 has 2 UHS 2 card slots, even with the bigger file sizes, it wrote to the card much faster. So because the A7R3 has 1 UHS 2 slot, you're kind of bottlenecked by that if you're shooting RAW to both cards, and it just kind of slows the whole thing down. It's still fine, the buffer is still plenty big enough, so again, not really a necessity. Never been at a wedding where I've thought, man, I wish I had faster card slots. To be fair, I only have my camera set to 5 frames a second because I really don't need 10. So if you're a sports photographer, the R4 is probably going to be a better option if you don't want to go buy the A9. Obviously the viewfinder on the A7R4 is much nicer. It's the same as the Panasonic S1, and if you've looked through those, they're very impressive. The R4 is no slouch with that either. It's basically the same. The R3 viewfinder though, it's not really terrible. It's still a lot better than the A7RIII, and I don't have any issues with it. So I'm really happy with that. The LCD screen on the back of the R4 seems to be the same as the R3. I can't see any difference with it at all. It's probably the same panel. Really the only downside of the R4 for me was the file size. So in compressed RAW, they're about 60 megabytes each. In uncompressed, they're about 120 meg. I'm going to include some RAW files from this shoot so you can see for yourselves, along with the dynamic range test I've done. But the file sizes are just really massive, and that wedding was the first time. To be fair, I did overshoot quite a bit, but I filled up a 128 gig card, which I've never done ever in my wedding photography career. So that was only about 2200 photos in compressed RAW with a 128 gig card. And those Sony tough cards aren't cheap. So in uncompressed RAW, you're going to get maybe 1,000 photos on a 128 gig card, and that's just really not ideal. In terms of Lightroom speed, a lot of you guys asked me how they performed in compressed RAW, the A7R3 versus the R4. I couldn't notice any difference in lag or anything like that going through Lightroom. So that was a really nice thing to see. For me, it's more the storage and having those really expensive cards. I don't want to have to buy 4 256 gig cards, you know, 2 for each camera. But let's be honest, the main thing is the price. The R3 is so much cheaper, and the R4 is more of an upgrade rather than a new camera. So my advice to you guys, if you're already on the R3 and you're a little bit short on money, maybe you don't want to upgrade to the R4, then just stick with the R3. It's a fantastic camera. But the R4 is better. If you're not worried about the money, then just go and buy it. It's great. So I'm pretty happy with my decision with the two R3s. Side by side, they're a really good option. And you guys know, if you've been following for a while, I bought that A7R3, and I didn't really super regret it, but the LCD screen really bugged me. The viewfinder wasn't as nice, and just not being able to use that crop mode with the A7 III, you know, because the file sizes are so much smaller, was just kind of a deal breaker. So I'm happy that I'm back on two A7R3s. I can't wait for the A9 Mark II to come out. I really hope that comes out soon. I've heard nothing from Sony. Same with the A7S III. Don't ask me about it. I've never heard anything yet. But I have a feeling the A9 Mark II is going to be announced in a couple of months. So really, really fingers crossed, hoping that comes out, because I want one. I want that silent shutter back. So in short, summarizing all of that up into one basic sentence, the R4 is really an upgrade over the R3 rather than a whole new camera. I know that may seem obvious, but for example, the A7R2 to the R3 was a massive jump. Like I just said before, it's a huge jump in tech, and the benefits of the R3 just by miles outweighed the R2. It's not like that with the R4. So if you're coming into it new and you can afford it, then probably get the R4s. Otherwise, the R3 is still a really, really great option, and I'm really happy to be shooting this next season coming up with another two A7R3s. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next video tomorrow.